It only does like 15 minutes at a time, so I'll have to like reset it here in about 15 minutes. Okay, so Spanish-American War is over. We talked about it yesterday for those of you who were here. The Spanish-American War is kind of a farce. I mean, it's one major battle and that's it. So the war is over. Think, what is an acquisition? Great question. Like in terms of sports, people will talk about the acquisition line, like in the paper, and you go through and you look at trades and signings and things like that. So what's an acquisition? Something you gain. Okay. Like in the case of sports, an acquisition line is players that you've got through trades or signings or whatever. Here we're talking about acquisitions in the Spanish-American War. Basically, what did we get? Okay? What do we get? Like, look, you fight a war, people die, like, you expect to gain something. And we gain, like, if you were to just look at it in black and white, under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, now, look, I'm just going to say this. There are a lot of treaties that are called the Treaty of Paris. The treaty that's going to end World War I is going to be called the Treaty of Paris. There's a couple of other treaties throughout. It's just because that happens to be where they negotiated the peace treaty. But under the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1898, we get control of the following: the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Now, on paper, that seems pretty solid. Like, that's 4 territories. Like, you would think, like, it's quite a bit. There's some issues with this, though. None of these territories, like, immediately have, like, we don't extend rights to them at all. Okay. In the case of Puerto Rico, and I'm going to kind of get, and I can write over the text down here because we're not going to get into a ton of these questions. In the case of Puerto Rico, they're going to become a protectorate. The Philippines, for example, remember we talked about the Philippines were that group that Emilio Aguinaldo, they kind of looked at us as liberators. We're kind of like, yeah, America. We actually have to pay $20 million to the Spanish in order to acquire the Philippines, which is kind of weird. Normally, you would think that in a war, like, you fight the war, you win, you get the spoils of war. In this case, we have to pay $20 million. Cuba, again, Cuba's tricky. We're going to get into Cuba. Guam, I can kind of dispense with Guam right here. And I'm going to use the little map down here in the bottom left. Guam is this little itty-bitty island. It's kind of like right in there. It still is a part of the United States today. There's a whole thing, however long ago it was, when all the stuff with Kim Jong-un, the latest round of stuff with Kim Jong-un started, where the people of Guam were like, they sent news cameras and they did like a couple of stories about how these people are, like, this is everyday life. Like, they're so close, because they're so close to North Korea and China and things like that, that, like, when there's a missile scare, that's no big deal. It's a tiny island. Like, it's literally 3 miles by 5 miles. Okay. My dad was stationed there when he was in the Navy. The roads are made of, like, crushed coral. There's an island-wide speed limit of, like, 30, because if you go faster than that, like, it tears the roads up because they're literally made of coral. It's kind of a weird little place. But we do attain Guam through the Treaty of Paris. Now, the other 3, we're going to get into a little bit more detail now. But those are the basic acquisitions. Now, again, they kind of come with some strings attached that we'll get into now. So Puerto Rico is the first one up that we're going to talk about. We are very unsure. Puerto Rico is, again, you've got the map down here to give you a sense of the geography. Puerto Rico is on the other side of the Dominican Republic and Haiti from Cuba. Again, still in our backyard, still really close to Florida. You can see Miami right there. We are unsure And what we're unsure about is, should they be independent? Should they become a state? Or should they just be a territory? What's the difference between those three? Well, the first one's pretty self-explanatory. If we make Puerto Rico independent, what does that mean? Yeah, they're not controlled by anybody. They're their own country, essentially. Is that really ever an option, you think? I mean, not theoretically, it's on the table, but I mean, in all practicality, it's not. Should it become a U.S. state? And this is something that pops up every now and then. There will be this movement to make Puerto Rico the 51st state. Should they be a state? I mean, they're certainly a lot closer to us geographically than Hawaii is, right? You would think. So what we end up settling on is they are going to become a territory. Okay? Now, the issue of tax revenue and things like that, and this is true even today, is that Puerto Rico they're technically today, they are a protectorate. Which just means, like, we protect them, hence the term protectorate. We provide them military protection. We provide them some forms of economic protection. But they're not full-fledged citizens. So, like, taxes, they don't have to pay certain taxes. They also don't get to vote, like, for president. At least I don't think they do. They have a representative in the House of Representatives, but there are certain things that representative can't vote on. So why would we go through all this trouble for Puerto Rico, like this weird sort of relationship? Why do we do that? What do they have? What do they provide? That back in the day, it's another sugar. It's another one of those sugar producing islands. Today, what does Puerto Rico provide? Do they provide coffee? I don't know. When you think of Puerto Rico, what's the big thing you think of?
I like it.
Thank you. Vacation. It's tourism, right? And so we have this weird sort of relationship because they provide us an economic benefit, but they really don't fit. You'll find that Puerto Ricans, by and large, don't want to become a state. It's also strategic in terms of the military. It's a very strategic location because it's sort of at the head of the Caribbean. Okay. In other words, to get to Haiti, to get to Cuba, to get down into the Gulf of Mexico, like Puerto Rico is kind of at the head of that. So it's an important military location. And so we actually have this thing called the Foraker Act in 1900. It ends military presence to a certain extent, and it gives them a partially self-ruled government. Okay? Again, we sort of hold on to a little bit of influence, so it's going to be partially self-ruled, but only in part, right? What were you going to say, Nathan?
Do you have to have a passport to go to Puerto Rico?
That is a great question.
Don't they have dual citizenship?
I think both are correct. I think there's some kind of weird, again, I don't know that citizenship is the right word, but they're not subject, like Puerto Ricans are not subject to all of the same, like immigration laws, but I do think you have to have a passport. These are great questions. I actually know someone who is a native Puerto Rican, and the next time I see them, I can actually ask them those questions because those are actually really, really good questions. Puerto Rico is this like in terms of the government and in terms of our relations with that island, it's really kind of strange. Okay, so I'll have to ask them some of those questions when I see that person next. But this is again all the start of us sort of creating an empire in the wake of the Spanish-American War. Okay. So Puerto Rico, Cuba. Cuba is, again, in a lot of these cases, we are going to want to have our cake and eat it too. Okay. So here, and I apologize if this is hard to see, the U.S. wants Cuba to be independent, yet we want to maintain influence. Okay? So it's kind of one of those things where it's like, we want Cuba to be independent. We want them to be their own country, but we kind of want to be able to tell them what to do. You see what I'm saying? And that's a difficult relationship to make work, as we will soon find out. So in the initial aftermath of the war, while we occupy Cuba, while our military is still in Cuba, we make some internal improvements. Okay? When we talk about internal improvements, what are we talking about? Internal improvements like what? What are some things that at this point, the late 1800s, early 1900s, what are some things that we're starting to figure out, you think, that maybe an island like Cuba that's been under a foreign power for a long time, okay, so you could, maybe some industry. So industry, wow. Yeah, industry, technology, what else? And that sort of all plays into their economy. But yeah, sort of improving. And again, they already were improving our economy, right? By virtue of what? What's that? Okay, not back in the late 1800s.
Infrastructure.
Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Is like this, and that's infrastructure. Is what was the big draw? What was the big draw for places like Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico? What's the whole reason that we're even messing with it? Sugar. They're sugar plantations. So they're already benefiting our economy that way. We're going to start making some improvements to their industry to make sugar production a lot quicker, a lot more efficient. Improvements to their infrastructure like roads. Anytime we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about roads. We're talking about maybe canals, ports, anything that has to do with the transport of people or goods. Okay. We allow, and I'm going to have to cut this off and start another one. We allow a lot of the Spanish to keep their power. This is important. And when we talk about Spaniards, we're talking about civilians. We're not talking about the government, right? We're not allowing Spain to maintain their control of the government. We're allowing private Spanish civilians to maintain their power on the island of Cuba. So if you're a Spaniard and you own a sugar plantation, in a lot of cases, the United States allowed you to continue to own that. And that's going to become a problem down the road. Okay, that's probably a mistake on our part. Okay?